Welcome. Come inside. Have a seat. The witching hour is upon us. It's time to remove the old cobwebs from the book. Let the sounds and the stories take you deep into the forest where the nightmares await you. It was October of 1922 when the body of Old Man Baker was found laying in his cornfield, right next to a scarecrow that he had hung on a cross almost 20 years ago. Some people would say that he treated that scarecrow like family. He had been known to go out in the cornfield late at night and talk to the scarecrow. There was even rumors of him leaving a plate of food at the scarecrow's feet. Was he leaving the food for the scarecrow, or was he leaving the food for the crows? One thing is for certain. There was a mystery surrounding that scarecrow, and Old Man Baker, he took it to his grave. 1923, it's been 1 year since Old Man Baker passed away, and the rumors still haunt the town about what all took place in that cornfield. Old Man Baker had been in the ground just a few hours when the talk started. Everything from the scarecrow to the little girl who was found dead and buried out there, to Old Man Baker hiding his money under the dirt and the corn. Most people in the town didn't really pay a lot of attention to all the talk and gossip, but there was two brothers who did listen, and what they heard was money hiding in the ground. John and his brother Mike had lived in the town for a few years now, and they had been in trouble with the law more than once. But what happened to these two brothers on a cool, dark autumn night back in October of 1923 is still talked about today. "So what do you think, Mike?" John asked his brother as he opened another beer. "Do you think the money is really buried out there?" Mike just shook his head and said, "Don't know. But I hear if the story is true, he buried a lot of it under that dirt. They say it's not too far from that old worn-out looking scarecrow. What is the deal with that old thing anyway? People say he used to go out there late at night and talk to it, even feed it." John threw his beer bottle on the ground. "Bull crap. That's all just rumors, or just bull crap. The old man was nothing but a drunk who had too much money and time on his hands." "But what about the story of the little girl he buried out there?" "What about it?" John said. "I've heard they say that you can hear that little girl crying sometimes." "Yeah, whatever," John said. John picked up another beer and opened it, then turned to look at Mike. "Have you heard the rumor about the scarecrow?" Mike said. "Yeah, I just told you about it." "I'm not talking about that one," John replied. "When I was in town a few days ago, I overheard two guys talking about the scarecrow. They say that on certain nights, you can see it walking around in that cornfield. And also, it has been seen crawling back up on that cross." "Are you serious?" Mike asked. John just smiled at him. "Like I said before, pure bullcrap." "So what about it? Do you want to do this or not?" John asked. "You know I do, but I'm bringing my shotgun," Mike said. "Oh, just to be safe," John smiled. "Just to be safe, huh? You mean for protection, right?" Mike laughed. "Yeah, for protection." The night came and the two brothers took off to Old Man Baker's cornfield. "Once we get there, we will pull off the old dirt road about a quarter of a mile from his old shack. Once we get to that old rundown shack, we will go inside first. Look around. You never know what he buried inside the walls and floors," John said. "I got a feeling we're going to find something," Mike said as he loaded that shotgun. John slowed his old truck down and started pulling off onto the old dirt road. "This looks like a good spot," John said as he stopped the truck. "Grab the flashlight, Mike." John said as he stepped out of the truck. Mike grabbed the flashlight and stepped out, closing the door behind him. John reached into the bed and grabbed 2 shovels, along with another flashlight. You ready to do this, little brother? Mike turned on his flashlight and aimed it upwards, looking at the trees. Oh, you know I am, he said. Suddenly, a large crow flew down, yelling at them as it went over their heads. They both jumped back, and John yelled, "Get out of here!" They could hear the crow yelling again as it flew off. Stupid crow, John said as he clicked on his flashlight. The 2 brothers started down the old dirt road as their flashlights disappeared into the darkness. That same crow landed on the hood of the truck and tapped on it with its beak. The crow looked around and then let out a loud call as it jumped back into the air and took off behind the 2 brothers. As they walked down the old long dirt road, Mike looked over at his brother. Do you think it's true about the little girl? Don't know. Don't care. I know you don't care, Mike said. But just the fact that he found a little girl out in that cornfield is creepy, don't you think? And they buried her out there also. John stopped and grabbed Mike by his shirt. Will you shut up about that stupid rumor? But I heard it was just more than a rumor, Mike said, as he jerked away from John. John shook his head in disgust. All right. What did you hear, Mike? Tell me. I heard the little girl was around 8 years old, and her name was Amy. The old lady in town who runs the diner said that she had heard the little girl was old man Baker's niece, that she really didn't have anyone else but him, and she lived in that old shack. Also that she had gotten sick, and I think maybe it was pneumonia. She was playing in the cornfield when she started coughing and couldn't catch her breath. And they say that she died right there. So I guess when he found her, he decided just to bury her right there. Seriously, John said. That's what you heard? Mike shook his head. Yep, that's what I heard. John just shook his head. Are we done? Can we start walking again? Whatever, Mike said, as they both turned and started walking. The brothers had been walking for about 10 minutes when John stopped. Mike turned and looked at him. Why did you stop? Did you hear that? What? Mike replied. John walked up to Mike. You didn't hear that little girl? Mike started looking around with his flashlight. What? Are you serious? What did you hear? John pointed over towards the forest. Mike shined his flashlight in that direction when John pushed him sideways and yelled, Gah, got you, you fool. Mike shoved John and yelled, You idiot, don't you ever do that again. John just laughed at him when all of a sudden the crow flew over their heads calling out. The crow circled above them several times, calling as it circled. They both aimed their flashlights upward, trying to see the crow, but they couldn't see it. The crow called out once again. Let's go, Mike said. The 2 brothers took off running. They ran for about 5 minutes when they came across an old broken down wooden fence. They stood there catching their breath. This is the area, John said, shining his flashlight at the fence. I don't hear that crow anymore, Mike said. Don't worry about that stupid crow, John replied. The 2 brothers stepped over the old wooden fence and started walking. As they walked, they noticed that the night air began to get colder, and the wind began to blow. They hadn't walked very far when they heard the sound of crackling under their feet with every step. John stopped and shined his flashlight downward. He hit Mike on the arm. Look down, he said. Mike looked down at the ground and saw broken corn stalks everywhere. Mike aimed his flashlight straight ahead. John, look. John looked up straight ahead of them stemmed the cornfield. They stood there for a few seconds when they started walking toward it. As they got to the edge of the cornfield, the crow flew over once again. John looked at Mike and said with a shaky voice, You ready? Mike took a deep breath and shook his head yes. John reached out and poured the corn stalks open, and then turned and looked at Mike. Stay behind me, little brother. As they stepped into the cornfield, the wind began to blow harder. Ugh, what is that smell? Mike said, covering his mouth and nose. It might be all the dead corn stalks that have rotted over the years, John replied. They walked forward, pushed the corn stalks to each side until they come to an opening in the cornfield. As they stepped into the opening, they looked all around. All they could see was broken corn stalks laying everywhere. Let's go this way, John said. As they walked, Mike was looking around. Nothing but laid over corn stalks, and the ones that were standing were broke or bent over. Mike aimed his flashlight down at the ground. Then he stopped walking. John, Mike yelled. John stopped and turned around. Mike stood there pointing at the ground. John walked over to where Mike stood and looked down. That's a deer's head, John said as he bent down and picked it up. It's been ripped off. How can you tell? Mike said. Well, there's no saw marks, as if the hunter would cut the head off. You can see the way the skin is ripped. This head was ripped off. You think maybe it could have been a bear? John just shrugged his head. Maybe. I don't know. John threw the deer's head back down on the ground and said, Let's go. We're just wasting time standing here. As they walked away, 2 crows flew down and started pecking on the deer's head. How far out there is this place? Mike asked. No sooner than he had said that, John stopped and pointed straight ahead. There sat an old run-down shack. Suddenly a crow flew down and grazed the top of Mike's head with its claws. Mike yelled and jumped sideways, tripping over his feet. As he hit the ground, his flashlight fell from the hand and rolled sideways. Mike turned and grabbed the flashlight when he aimed it upwards. Mike stood up slowly, his flashlight shaking in his hand. John, look. John turned and looked in the direction of Mike's flashlight. Oh my God, he whispered to himself. There, straight ahead of the 2 brothers, hung the Scarecrow. 20 years of hanging on that old cross had not done the Scarecrow any good. The weather had taken its toll on its body and clothes. The black pointed top hat had faded almost gray. The blue shirt that it wore was torn and covered in cobwebs. The pants were ripped and one leg was longer than the other because of the rain filling up one of the old work boots that was tied to the pants with a rope. The old brown gloves that hung on the ends of the sleeves were dried and cracked open from the sun. There was 2 holes cut for the eyes and a small burlap sack that was filled with straw. The mouth was cut open, but had stitches in it like it had been sewn shut at one time or another. The old Scarecrow hung there drooped over, with its head hung down as if it was staring at the ground. Suddenly a strong gust of wind came through the field, and the Scarecrow moved just a little from side to side. Did you see that? Mike yelled as he jumped back. Shut up, John said. It's just the wind. Are you sure? Don't be stupid, Mike. It's not real. I don't know, man. I don't like this. John walked over to the Scarecrow in disgust and hit the Scarecrow in the head with a flashlight. You see, John yelled, nothing. Absolutely nothing. You shouldn't have done that, Mike said, looking all around. Done what? This? John said as he turned and struck the Scarecrow once more in the face. The old straw-filled head just swayed from one side to the other. I don't want to hear anything else about this stupid Scarecrow. You understand? Now come on, let's get this over with. As they started toward the cabin, Mike shook his head and hurried along right behind him, only turning around once and looking back to the Scarecrow. It hadn't moved. It still hung there, staring down at the ground. As their flashlights disappeared into the cornfield, the sound of corn stalks snapping and cracking could be heard in the distance. They got louder the closer it got. Then the sound stopped, right behind the Scarecrow. Heavy breathing filled the night air as the Scarecrow's body began to move from side to side as it was waking up. Then it raised up. John pushed the door open slowly to the old shack. The door gave out a loud creak as it opened. The 2 walked in and slowly looked around. You check that room and check the floors, and I'll check this one, John said. Mike turned into what looked like to be an old bedroom. There was a small bed and one small dresser. Mike walked over and jerked the drawers open. Nothing but dust flew out. Mike coughed as he stepped back and turned and looked at the bed. He started towards it. The room that John had entered was the living room. It only had a couch and 2 rocking chairs. As he walked across the room, the floor began to creak, and he noticed that the boards in the floor were loose. John bent down and started pulling up the floor. Mike pushed the bed sideways when he saw a small wooden box. He reached down and opened it. It was a small music box. He reached under it and turned the key. The music began to play for a few seconds, but he could tell it was a child's music box. The tone was creepy and off-key. Suddenly, Mike dropped the box from his hands as he heard the voice of a small child. "What? Who is that?" he said out loud. Mike ran from the room and yelled for John. "Shut up, Mike, I'm in here." Mike ran to the room and grabbed John by the shirt. "We need to leave, like right now." "Why?" John said in a disgusted voice. "I just heard a little girl's voice in that room. First, you're scared of a stupid scarecrow, and now you're hearing a child's voice. You need to get your head back in the game." Suddenly, John stopped talking. They both turned slowly as they could hear the footsteps walking through the house. "Let's go," Mike said. "Shut up," John replied. The music box began to play once more when the little girl spoke again.
"Mommy? Mommy?"
"I'm not staying a minute longer in this house," Mike said as he turned and ran out of the shack. Mike jumped off the porch and ran into the cornfield. John was still in shock from hearing the little girl's voice. Suddenly he realized that Mike had taken off. "Mike!" John yelled as he ran onto the front porch. "Where are you, Mike?" he yelled. Mike ran fast into the cornfield, but didn't realize he ran the wrong way. The cornstalks were hitting him in the face as he ran, trying to push them away, when he heard John's voice echoing through the cornfield. He stopped. "John!" Mike yelled. "John, I'm over here!" he yelled. He started to yell again when he stopped. He heard the sound of cornstalks breaking and snapping. He dropped down onto the ground and laid flat on his stomach, placing his hands over his mouth. The sounds got louder and louder. Something was coming toward him. The sound stopped. Mike lay there, not moving at all. The sound of crows filled the darkness as the wind began to blow. Mike took his hands away from his mouth slowly and started to say something when he heard the little girl crying. Mike closed his eyes and told himself, "It's not real. It's not real." The sound of John's voice filled the air as he yelled, "Mike, where are you?" Mike jumped up and yelled, "Over here, John. I'm over." Mike stopped yelling. The sound of cornstalks snapping right behind him. He turned slowly. No, you're not real. You can't be real." There in front of him stood the Scarecrow. Mike started walking backwards, trying not to fall. "You can't be real," Mike yelled, tripping and falling backwards. He raised back up quickly to see the Scarecrow standing in front of him. Mike raised his flashlight, slowly aimed it upwards. "Please, no, you can't be real." Mike started to say something else when he stopped. His voice began to quiver and his eyes filled up with water. The Scarecrow wasn't walking. It was being carried. A huge pair of hands were holding the Scarecrow under its arms. The hands were covered in hair. Mike could see long fingers and jagged fingernails. The hands began to lower the Scarecrow, revealing the face of what was holding it. A massive cone-shaped forehead began to appear, then a large brow ridge. Mike shook with terror as 2 big eyes that were sunk deep back into the sockets appeared. The face was covered in dirty, wet-looking black hair. Mike began to crawl backwards slowly. As he moved, the creature took a step forward, still holding the Scarecrow. Mike jumped up and took off running. The Scarecrow's limp body fell to the ground as the creature dropped it and took off after Mike. The long legs and massive feet of this creature caused it to take huge strides as it ran. As Mike ran straight ahead, screaming for John, the creature ran off toward the right side of the cornfield. Mike ran as fast as he could, trying not to fall over the bent corn stalks, when he stopped to catch his breath. He turned to yell for John once more when he was struck with a massive force, knocking him backwards. As Mike hit the ground, he could feel the warmness of blood running down his face and into his mouth. Mike turned his head and could see the flashlight laying on the right side. As he reached for it, he saw two massive legs walking up. He tried reaching for the light, but it was too late. Before Mike could even stretch out his arm, the creature was on top of him. The last thing he felt was the large fingers as they gripped the top of his head. John had run into the cornfield and was yelling for Mike to answer him. The crows began to yell. As he ran, the cornstalks were hitting him, and the sharp, dried, broke-off edges were cutting into his arm. John stopped running when he saw the reflection from a flashlight laying on the ground. He stood there trying to catch his breath, yelling, "Mike! Mike!" John didn't get an answer back, but he did hear a voice. The little girl began to speak again.
"Mommy? Mommy?"
"We didn't hurt you," John yelled. "Where's my brother?" The little girl kept talking. John walked over to the flashlight, picking it up. He could feel the flashlight was wet and sticky. He shined his flashlight onto it. It was covered in blood. "Where's my brother? What did you do to him?" The little girl began to laugh. Her laugh grew louder and louder and started echoing into the cornfield. Suddenly, her laugh stopped. The sound of something large running through the cornfield caused John to drop the flashlight and take off. John ran as fast as he could for a few seconds when he tripped and fell. As he hit the ground, he felt his leg snap. John lay there yelling in pain when the sound of something heavy began to walk around him. He could hear the cornstalks cracking and snapping all around him. The creature was pacing back and forth, staying in the darkness. John grabbed his flashlight and aimed it upwards. The sound stopped. He laid there, shaking with fear and looking all around. John didn't even have time to hear the cornstalks behind him open up when a massive hand grabbed him through the cornstalks and grabbed him by the hair of his head. John screamed as he was being dragged backwards through the cornfield. He dropped his flashlight as he was being dragged, so total darkness was all around him. Suddenly, he felt the cornstalks no more and felt dirt laying all around him. The creature let go of him and left him laying there. As he heard it walking away, John felt the ground around him, nothing but dirt and falling cornstalks. He raised up slowly as he could feel blood running down his face from where the creature's claws dug into his scalp. He tried to stand but couldn't because his leg was broken in two places. He fell back to the ground looking up into the darkness. The sound of crows could be heard in the distance, and the wind began to blow. John could hear what sounded like a whisper. He raised up quickly looking all around but couldn't see anything but darkness. Was his mind playing tricks on him? Was he hearing whispers in the wind? The wind began to blow harder, and the sound of the crows began to get louder. John yelled, "Where's my brother?" The wind began to swirl all around, and the whisper began to get louder and louder. Suddenly, the sound of crows were all above him. He looked up and started to yell once more when he stopped. The whisper he had begun to hear was suddenly clear and filled his eardrums. John began to shake, and tears filled his eyes as he heard the last sound he would ever hear. Do you feel that? That's not the wind. That's death coming. The creature grabbed John by his shoulders and jerked him back to the ground, holding him there as the crows descended upon him. John's scream did not last long, as the crows ripped his tongue from his mouth, and his eyes were next. Rumors began to start around the town how the two brothers had disappeared. The local sheriff said the only thing they ever found was a pair of black boots in the dirt, and on top of one of them boots sat a crow. Poor John and his little brother. They should have never went looking for what didn't belong to them. Well, guys and gals, I hope you enjoyed the Scarecrow in the cornfield. Our next little creepy story will revolve around a girl who comes back from the grave to take back what belongs to her. It's a creepy little tale called The Night Amy Came Home.